At one ancient Mesopotamian gate, a person's status could change forever. Sumerian traditions describe a realm where the dead belonged to a different order, and ordinary humans weren't expected to simply walk back into life. Yet one remarkable story tells of a return and reveals the terrible price attached to crossing that divide. Why could certain people never come back once they had entered the world below? The answer isn't hidden in a modern legend. It emerges from ancient burials, underworld rituals, and a story involving a powerful goddess who discovered that even divine authority had limits. Before we uncover the reason, tell us where you're watching from. The evidence left beside the dead. The first clues don't come from a dramatic underworld story. They come from graves. Across ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered burials containing human remains alongside pottery, ornaments, tools, containers, and other objects. The exact meaning of these items isn't always certain, and burial customs changed across centuries and regions. Still, one pattern stands out. People took deliberate steps when someone died. A body was placed carefully. Objects could be left beside it. The grave received a defined location. Relatives could continue visiting or caring for the burial. Such practices don't prove exactly what every individual believed about an afterlife. They do show the death was treated as a major transition rather than simple disappearance. The distinction becomes important because physical evidence and written evidence answer different questions. Archaeology can show what people did. Cuneiform literature can reveal how later generations described the world beyond death. That second category contains some of Mesopotamia's most famous stories. There's also an important dating issue behind the title. The tradition surrounding death in the underworld reaches deep into early Mesopotamian history, but surviving written cuneiform tablets generally come from the late 4th millennium BCE onward and later periods. So the phrase, 6,000-year-old, should not be understood as claiming that an authenticated surviving Sumerian tablet was literally written 6,000 years ago. It points toward the great antiquity of the cultural tradition behind the story. That distinction matters because historical evidence becomes stronger when its limits are clear. The earliest writing from Mesopotamia was not created as a collection of supernatural mysteries. Scribes recorded practical matters, names, transactions, religious material, and events involving rulers and temples. Over time, literary compositions were copied and preserved, allowing later generations to transmit much older traditions. Among those traditions was a powerful idea about the world beneath the living one. The dead did not simply vanish. They entered another condition. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe an underworld associated with the dead, often portrayed as a separate realm with its own powers and restrictions. The living belonged to the world above. The deceased belonged elsewhere. This separation appears especially clearly in Inanna's descent to the Netherworld. The story follows Inana, a major Mesopotamian goddess, as she decides to descend into the realm ruled by her sister, Ereshkigal. Her journey begins like a deliberate act. Then the rules take control. Inanna approaches a series of gates. At each one, another item connected with her authority is removed. Her appearance changes. Her protection is stripped away. The powerful goddess who began the journey gradually loses the signs that identify her as a figure of authority from the living world. By the time she reaches the deepest part of the underworld, she is no longer entering as an untouchable divine ruler. She is exposed. The story then becomes darker. Inanna is judged. Her condition changes completely. She dies within the underworld. Her body remains there. For the moment, there is no return. The graves showed that the living continued caring for those who had died. Inanna's journey reveals the other side of that relationship. The realm of the dead was not imagined as somewhere a person could enter and leave without consequences. The deeper question now becomes impossible to ignore. If even a goddess could be stopped by the laws of that realm, what happened when an ordinary human crossed the same threshold? The answer waits behind the next stage of Inanna's story, where an attempted return reveals just how strict the separation between life and death was believed to be. The world beneath the living, the answer begins with what happened after Inanna's death. Her journey had already shown that the underworld wasn't simply another place that a powerful being could visit. Once she entered, her authority weakened, her status changed, and the laws of that realm took control. Her death makes the point even stronger. Inanna's body remained below. Her absence affected the world above. A divine figure had crossed into a condition from which ordinary return was not expected. Yet the story doesn't end with her disappearance. Her companion Ninsabur seeks help. The search eventually reaches Enki, the god associated with wisdom and the subterranean freshwater realm. Enki understands that something has gone terribly wrong, But his solution isn't to pretend that death never happened. Instead, he creates a way to intervene. The method is unusual. Small supernatural beings are formed and sent into the underworld. Their task isn't to fight Ereshkigal or overpower the realm's rulers. They approach the suffering goddess with sympathy, recognizing her pain rather than challenging her authority. That response matters. The story presents the underworld as a place where normal power has limits. Even divine beings must work within its conditions. Eventually, the intervention succeeds. Inana is restored. But restoration doesn't mean freedom. The underworld authorities require a replacement. Inana cannot simply return to the living world while leaving the realm below without compensation. The story therefore introduces a troubling condition. Someone else must take her place. The goddess begins traveling through the world above, accompanied by the beings enforcing the demand. Now the story changes direction. Inana encounters people who respond differently to her return. Some show grief. Some show respect. Others behave as though her disappearance caused them little concern. Eventually, she reaches Dumuzi. His reaction makes him stand apart. Rather than responding with the expected grief, he appears comfortable and richly dressed. Inanna's decision follows. Dumuzi becomes the one required to spend time in the underworld, while his sister Gishtanana later shares that burden. The resulting cycle became connected with seasonal ideas of disappearance and return. Yet the important point is not simply that a god or goddess came back. The important point is what had to happen before that return was possible. Inanna needed outside intervention. Her restoration came with conditions. Another being had to bear the consequence. The underworld did not simply open its gates because she wanted to leave. This makes the story very different from a simple resurrection tale. The journey shows that crossing into the realm of the dead changed the normal rules of existence. Inanna had returned, but the price attached to her return was the real revelation. The underworld had not been defeated. Its demand had been satisfied. That leaves the central question of the investigation. If a powerful goddess required intervention, negotiation, and a replacement before she could leave, what did ancient Mesopotamian traditions expect from an ordinary human who entered the same realm? To answer that, the story of the goddess must briefly give way to the people who actually lived, died, and were buried across Mesopotamia. Their evidence is quieter than Inanna's descent, but it may tell us more about what ordinary people were expected to face after death. The price of coming back, Inanna's return, becomes more revealing when the story is viewed from the perspective of the living. Her restoration was not a reset. She had crossed into the realm below, died there, and could only leave after another being accepted the consequence of her absence. The story makes one thing clear. Returning was never presented as an ordinary human ability. Inanna's situation was exceptional from the beginning. She was a goddess entering a divine realm, surrounded by powers far beyond anything available to ordinary people. Even with that status, she could not simply command the gates to open. Her authority failed. Her life ended. Someone else had to intervene. That sequence gives the story its deeper meaning. The underworld wasn't portrayed as a place where the dead waited for permission to come home. It was a separate state of existence, controlled by powers that belonged to that realm. Inanna's restoration therefore required a special path. Enki's intervention provides that path, but the price attached to it prevents the return from becoming meaningless. The goddess comes back only after the underworld's demand has been addressed. Dumuzi's fate makes the cost visible. He becomes connected with the realm below, while Gestinata shares the burden. Their alternating presence later became linked with seasonal cycles, giving the story another layer of meaning. Loss and return could exist together, but not without sacrifice. The pattern is important. Life could return in a myth. A season could return. A deity could return. Yet the individual who crossed into the realm of the dead could not simply reverse the journey without extraordinary circumstances. This distinction separates mythology from ordinary human experience. Ancient stories often gave gods abilities that humans did not possess. Divine beings could shape storms, control rivers, descend beneath the earth, or alter the fate of mortals. Their actions weren't meant to establish a normal path for everyone else. The same principle applies here. Inanna's return doesn't prove that Sumerians believed every dead person could come back. It shows the opposite. The story makes her return so difficult precisely because the normal condition was separation. The remarkable part isn't that Inanna returned, it's what the story refuses to make ordinary. No grieving family is shown opening a grave and calling a relative back to life. No human character discovers a simple method for reversing death. No ritual is presented as a guaranteed way to restore everyone who has died. Instead, the return belongs to a rare divine event. That difference becomes even more important when looking at Mesopotamian burial practices. Archaeological evidence shows that families continued to care about deceased relatives. Objects could accompany the body. Burial spaces could remain part of the community's memory. The dead were not treated as meaningless remains. Yet caring for someone after death was not the same as expecting them to return physically. A grave preserved a connection. It did not provide a doorway. Offerings could express remembrance. They did not restore ordinary life. The distinction may seem obvious today, but it helps explain ancient customs that can otherwise appear mysterious. The living needed a way to maintain a relationship with someone who was no longer physically present. Ritual provided that connection. The underworld provided a destination. Memory provided continuity. None of those things required the deceased to walk back into the household. This helps explain why ancient Mesopotamian traditions could speak about the dead as continuing to exist while still treating death as a permanent change. The person had not necessarily become nothing. Their place had changed. Their relationship with the living had changed. Their role within the household had changed. The world above continued without their physical presence. The evidence now points toward a distinction that is easy to miss. Ancient Mesopotamians could imagine existence beyond death, without imagining ordinary humans escaping it. The question wasn't simply whether someone continued after dying. It was whether they could return to the life they had left. For ordinary people, the answer appears to have been no. And that answer becomes much clearer when the archaeological record is placed beside the stories of the underworld. The next step is to leave the gods almost entirely behind and examine what this belief meant for the ordinary person whose name, body, and family remained above. What happened to ordinary humans? The clearest evidence comes from people who never appeared in heroic stories at all. They were farmers, craftspeople, parents, children, workers, and household members whose lives ended without becoming part of a famous myth. Their graves are less dramatic than Inanna's descent, but they reveal something essential about how death was handled in everyday Mesopotamian society. A body was prepared, a burial place was chosen, objects could be placed nearby. Family connections continued through remembrance and ritual. These actions show that death did not erase a person's importance. The deceased could remain part of family memory long after physical life had ended. Yet nothing about ordinary burial suggests that relatives expected the dead person to return and resume the same life. That distinction is central. Remembering someone is not the same as expecting their physical return. An offering can honor the dead without bringing them back. A grave can preserve someone's place in family history without becoming a doorway between worlds. Ritual can maintain a relationship without reversing what happened at death. Mesopotamian evidence fits this pattern remarkably well. The living continued their responsibilities above ground, while the deceased belonged to another condition. The two remained connected through memory and religious practice, but they were not treated as interchangeable states. This also explains why the underworld could be imagined as a real part of the cosmic order. The world above had its own duties. People worked, families grew, temples operated, cities depended on cooperation. The dead belonged to a different sphere. Separating those conditions gave ancient communities a way to understand an unavoidable fact of human existence. Every generation eventually lost people it could not bring back. The belief did not require death to mean complete non-existence. Instead, it allowed the deceased to continue in another form while preserving a firm distinction between those who were living and those who had passed away. That distinction appears in the language of ancient literature as well. The underworld is not presented as a second city where the living can freely travel. Its rulers have authority. Its inhabitants have a different status. Entry carries consequences. This is why Inanna's experience matters even though she was not human. Her story provides an extraordinary example against which ordinary experience can be measured. She required divine assistance. She faced a condition imposed by the underworld. Her return affected another divine figure. Nothing about the event resembles an ordinary human being dying and then choosing to come home. The quiet graves may therefore be more revealing than the dramatic myths. A myth can show what the gods could do. A burial shows what families actually did when death arrived. They cared for the body. They remembered the person. They continued the relationship through ritual. Then they continued living. That pattern suggests that the permanent separation between life and death was not simply a dramatic idea created for stories. It was connected with the practical experience of losing members of a community. Death changed the household. A worker disappeared from daily labor. A parent left children behind. A spouse lost a partner. A child became part of family memory. life had to reorganize around that absence. The Underworld gave that absence a place within the ancient worldview. Instead of saying that the deceased had simply vanished, Mesopotamian traditions could describe them as belonging to another realm. This offered a way to imagine continuity without confusing it with physical return. That is an important difference from many modern interpretations. Ancient underworld stories are sometimes presented as if they were secret descriptions of resurrection, supernatural technology, or hidden physical locations beneath the earth. The surviving evidence doesn't require those explanations. A simpler interpretation fits the evidence more closely. The stories were concerned with death, loss, order, ritual, and the relationship between the living and the dead. Their strange imagery reflects an attempt to explain an experience that no society can avoid. Someone dies, the body remains, the family remembers, the community continues, the deceased belongs to another condition. Return to ordinary life is not expected. The title's claim can now be understood without turning the ancient evidence into something it never said. Certain humans could not return after death because ordinary human death represented the lasting change of condition. The texts don't need a secret mechanism to explain it. The worldview itself provides the answer. Yet one deeper question remains. Why was this separation so important to the ancient Mesopotamian understanding of existence? The answer lies in how they imagined order itself. And that final connection changes what the ancient stories are really telling us. Why the dead could not simply return. The deeper answer lies in the way Mesopotamian culture understood order. Life was not viewed as a loose collection of events. People had places within families, households, temples, and cities. Each person carried duties, relationships, and responsibilities. Death removed someone from that network and changed their place within the world. A farmer no longer worked his field. A parent no longer raised children. A ruler no longer governed. A craftsperson no longer practiced a trade. The community had to continue without them. Death, therefore, meant more than the end of breathing. It marked a permanent change in a person's role. Ancient beliefs about the underworld gave that change a destination. The deceased belonged to another realm. The living remained above. Ritual connected the two without making them identical. Families could remember the dead. They could perform offerings. They could preserve names. They could maintain traditions associated with ancestors, yet the deceased remained absent from ordinary daily life. That distinction helps explain why returning from death was so unusual in Mesopotamian literature. A return would not simply restore one individual. It would reverse a change that the entire social order had already accepted. Inana's story makes that idea visible through mythology. Her return required intervention because she was not simply crossing from one city to another. She was moving between two different conditions of existence. The gods could create exceptions. Ordinary people could not rely on those exceptions. The difference is crucial when reading ancient stories today. A modern audience may see a supernatural return and immediately ask whether the story describes resurrection. Ancient writers were often exploring a broader question. What happens when someone leaves the human world, and how can the living understand that loss? The answer was expressed through gods, gates, judgment, ritual, and an underworld populated by those who had crossed beyond ordinary life. The imagery was dramatic because the subject itself was enormous. Every family eventually faced it. Every generation watched someone disappear. Every community had to develop ways to remember people who could no longer participate in daily life. The underworld gave that reality a structure. It explained why the dead could still matter while remaining separate from the living. There is another important detail hidden inside that idea. If the dead could remain meaningful without physically returning, then the purpose of remembering them was not to reverse death. It was to preserve a relationship across a permanent change. That makes burial customs easier to understand. A grave could hold the remains of someone whose identity continued in family memory. An offering could express care without functioning as a resurrection ritual. A name could survive even when the person did not. The living could speak about someone who was gone while accepting that the person's place in the household had changed forever. Such practices turned grief into something the community could manage. The same worldview also explains why exceptional stories were so powerful. A divine return stood out precisely because it was not ordinary. If every human could cross between life and death whenever they wished, there would be little reason for ancient writers to make such journeys difficult, dangerous, and costly. Instead, the stories emphasize separation. Inanna loses her symbols of power. Her life ends below. Her restoration requires intervention. Her return creates consequences. Each detail reinforces the seriousness of crossing from one condition into another. The ancient writers were not necessarily describing a physical wall beneath the earth. They were expressing a social and religious idea through myth. Death changed where a person belonged. That change was real enough to shape burial, remembrance, storytelling, and religious thought. The most useful conclusion, therefore, is not that Sumerians possessed secret knowledge about defeating death. Their surviving traditions reveal something more human. They were trying to make sense of a permanent experience. They needed an explanation for why people disappeared from daily life, while remaining important in memory. They needed rituals for those left behind. They needed stories that could give shape to grief. And they needed a way to imagine where the dead belonged. The Underworld provided that framework. The mystery from the title now reaches its deepest point. Certain humans could not return after death because death was understood as a lasting transition into another condition, not a temporary journey that ordinary people could reverse. Inanna's return was extraordinary, human death was not. The difference between those two ideas is the key to understanding the ancient evidence. And it leaves one final question worth asking. If the dead could not simply return, what did Mesopotamians believe their existence was like after they crossed into the world below? That question opens the door to an even darker part of the ancient record. The mystery was never simply about returning from death. It was about what happened when life ended, and why ancient Mesopotamians believed that crossing could not normally be reversed. Inanna's extraordinary return only highlights the rule faced by ordinary humans. What was the dead person's existence like below? Watch the next documentary to uncover that darker ancient mystery.